The wind had a sound like a blade sharpening itself on stone. It scoured the valley, peeling back the thin blanket of new snow to reveal the hard, frozen earth beneath. Dusk was coming on fast, a bruise of purple and gray spreading across the western sky, draining the last of the day's weak light. In this vast, empty stillness, the wreckage of the wagon was a dark scar, a monument to a violence that had come and gone as swiftly as a hawk's shadow. Splintered wood and shattered crates lay scattered around the overturned carriage. A bolt of fine wool, meant for some merchant's shop, had unspooled in the attack, its vibrant red a shocking stain against the snow. Near the broken wheel, half buried in a drift, was the woman. She was a canvas of ruin. Her dress, once the pristine white of a bride, was torn and smeared with mud and blood. The delicate lace at the collar ripped away. One of her legs was bent at an angle that defied nature, the bone having broken through the skin before the cold began its merciful work of numbing the pain to a dull, relentless throb. She was not conscious of the cold anymore. Not really. It had seeped so deep into her bones that it felt like a part of her, a heavy, final stillness that was pulling her down into the snow. But sound still found its way through the fog, a rhythmic, crunching sound, steady and close. Hoofbeats. The sound did not register as hope. In the frozen landscape of her mind, where the echoes of shouting men and the crack of a pistol still lingered, it was only a harbinger of more pain. A faint whimper escaped her chapped lips. A puff of white vapor instantly snatched away by the wind. Her eyes, clouded with fever and fear, fluttered open. She saw a shape detaching itself from the gloom, a man on a horse, large and dark against the dying light. The terror was a physical thing, a shard of ice in her gut. She tried to push herself up, to crawl, to flee, but her body was a leaden weight, and the broken leg sent a bolt of white-hot agony through her that stole her breath. Her voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, barely louder than the sighing of the wind in the pines. "Please," she rasped, the word tearing at her raw throat. "Please, don't hurt me. I can't walk." The rider pulled his horse to a halt. For a long moment, he just sat there, studying the scene with an unnerving stillness. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, his features obscured by a thick, dark beard and the brim of a worn hat. He dismounted not with a leap, but with a slow, deliberate swing of his leg over the saddle, his boots making a soft thud in the snow. He did not approach her immediately. His eyes, sharp and dark, scanned the wreckage, taking in the dead driver half hidden by a snow-dusted bush, the looted chests, the tracks of the shod horses that had long since fled. His gaze was that of a man reading a familiar, ugly story. Finally, he turned his attention back to her. He walked slowly, his steps measured, careful not to seem a threat. As he drew closer, she could see more of him. 2 long, dark braids, woven with otter fur in the Apache way, were tucked beneath his hat, a detail that would have sent a chill of a different kind through most folks. But Emma was past caring about such things. She only saw the size of him, the sheer physical power held in his frame, and she flinched, turning her head away, bracing for a blow or worse. He stopped a few feet from her and shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat. It was an old coat, worn smooth in places, smelling faintly of wood smoke, leather, and the cold mountain air. He laid it over her, the sudden weight and warmth a shock to her system. He knelt beside her then, his movements economical and sure. He did not speak. His gloved fingers went to her wrist, checking for the faint, thready pulse. Then, his gaze fell to her leg. Gently, he pushed aside the torn fabric of her dress. The sight was grim. The bone had pierced the skin, and the wound was swollen and angry. The flesh around it a discolored purple. Infection had already taken hold. He touched the skin near the break, his touch surprisingly light, and she hissed in a sharp breath of pain but was too weak to pull away. He looked at her face, at the bluish tint of her lips, the waxy pallor of her skin. She could not walk. That was the least of it. Soon, she would not be able to do anything at all. Without a word, he stood. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to leave her there, abandon her to the night and the wolves that would surely be drawn by the scent of blood. But he went to his horse, a big, steady-looking roan, and pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. He came back and knelt again, lifting her head with one hand. "Drink," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting at the bottom of a creek bed. It was the first word he had spoken. She drank, the water so cold it hurt her teeth. But it was life. It was a tether to a world she had felt herself slipping away from. He let her have a few sips before pulling the canteen away. Then, with a quiet grunt, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. "This will hurt," he stated, not as an apology, but as a simple fact. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. A scream tore from her throat as the broken legs shifted, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed in the silent valley. She felt consciousness fraying at the edges, the world dissolving into a gray swirl of pain and cold. She was vaguely aware of being settled on the front of his saddle, her head lolling against the solid wall of his chest. He swung up behind her, his body a shield against the wind. He wrapped the reins in one hand and his other arm came around her, holding her secure. He nudged the horse into a slow, careful walk, away from the scene of the attack and into the deepening wilderness. The journey was a blur. Miles of snow-choked forest and wind-swept ridges passed in a fever dream. The motion of the horse was a constant, jarring agony, but the man's hold was firm, unwavering. He did not speak, and the only sounds were the creak of the saddle leather, the horse's breathing, and the relentless moan of the wind. She drifted in and out, at times aware of the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, at others lost in nightmares of her past, of a life that had led her to this frozen hell. The town was miles away, a distant memory of lights and noise. He was taking her deeper into the mountains, into a valley scarred by ancient rockfalls and heavy drifts of snow, a place where the world felt raw and unfinished. Finally, a shape emerged from the trees, a small cabin, tucked into the side of a hill, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was a lonely, isolated place, the sort of home a man builds when he wants to be left entirely alone. He dismounted and carefully lifted her down, carrying her through the simple wooden door and into the single room. The inside was warmer than the grave she had been lying in, but not by much. A small fire struggled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. The cabin was sparse and impeccably clean. A narrow bed was built into one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves holding a few tins of food. Some books and neatly stacked furs lined another wall. There were no decorations, no comforts, nothing to suggest a life beyond mere survival. He laid her gently on the bed, on a mattress stuffed with pine needles and covered with a thick buffalo hide. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably now, her body racked with violent shivers. He went to the fire, added more wood until it roared to life, and then put a kettle of water on to boil. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was both calming and intimidating. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man who knew precisely what needed to be done. He came back to her with a basin of hot water, a clean rag, and a bottle of whiskey. He cut away the ruined remnants of her dress with a hunting knife, his movements deft and impersonal, his eyes focused solely on the task. She closed her own eyes, a flush of shame heating her face. But she was too cold, too broken to protest. He cleaned the wound on her leg, flushing it with whiskey. The sting was so intense it made her body arch off the bed, a strangled cry escaping her lips. "Hold still," he commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight, and she forced her body to relax, biting down on her lip until she tasted blood. He worked for what felt like hours. He set the bone as best he could, the snap of it aligning, making her see stars. She cried out, the tears freezing on her cheeks, but she did not fight him. There was a strange sense of surrender in her, a recognition that this silent, formidable man was her only chance. He fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate and strips of leather, his hands strong and sure. He bandaged the wound with clean cloth, then wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, tucking it tightly around her. He forced her to drink a hot, bitter tea made from herbs he crushed himself. It tasted of earth and pine and something else she could not name, but it warmed her from the inside out, dulling the sharpest edges of the pain and the shivering. He sat on a chair by the fire, watching her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind outside. Finally, she found her voice again, though it was still weak and hoarse. "My name is Emma," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his shadowed face. I was on my way to Silver Creek, to be married, to a merchant there." She swallowed, the memory of her supposed future now a distant, hollow thing. "A man named Silas Croft. He sent for me. It was an arrangement. My father—" Her voice trailed off. She could not bring herself to say the words old. "The wagon was robbed. They shot the driver. I think Mr. Croft's man, the one who came to collect me, is dead too." The man listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her. When she fell silent, he waited a moment, as if to be sure she was finished. "Luke," he said simply. She waited for more, for an explanation of who he was, what he was doing so deep in these mountains, but nothing else came. "You live here alone?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He gave a slight nod. "The mountains are my only peace." The statement was a closed door. It was an answer that provided no information, only a definitive boundary. He was a man who did not wish to be known. Emma was too exhausted to press further. The warmth of the fire, the bitter tea, and the release from the biting cold were pulling her down into a heavy, dreamless sleep. Later that night, she woke with a start. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with a deep, profound quiet. Her leg throbbed with a dull, insistent beat, and a burning heat radiated through her body. The fever was taking hold. She turned her head on the pillow, and her eyes fell upon Luke. He was not asleep. He sat at the table, his back to her, shirtless in the dim light. A small lamp cast a pool of yellow glow around him, illuminating the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders, crisscrossed with old, faded scars that spoke of a violent history. He was hunched over his own arm, his movements slow and precise. In his hand was a needle and thread, and he was meticulously sewing a deep gash on his forearm, pulling the skin together with steady, practiced stitches. He had not been unscathed in whatever had happened at the wagon, or perhaps the wound was from something else entirely. Another battle fought in this unforgiving wilderness. He seemed completely absorbed in his task, unaware that she was watching. He finished the last stitch, bit the thread, and began to wrap his arm with a clean strip of cloth. The sight of his quiet, solitary suffering struck a chord deep inside her. He was a man wrapped in secrets, a man who tended his own wounds in the dead of night. A question formed in her fevered mind, a question born of the strange intimacy of their shared silence and pain. "Have you ever been married, Luke?" she whispered into the darkness. He froze for a second, his hand stilling on the bandage. He did not turn around, but she felt the change in the air, the sudden tension in his broad back. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. She thought he would retreat back into his impenetrable silence and leave her alone with the ghosts in the room. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy, filled with a sorrow so old it seemed a part of the very timbers of the cabin. "Yes," he said, "once." He paused, and she held her breath, waiting. "Long ago." And that was all. He said nothing more. He finished tying off the bandage, stood up, and added a log to the fire, his movements once again deliberate and controlled. He did not look at her. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his unspoken loss, a phantom that joined the specter of her own ruined future in the small, dark cabin while the winter wind howled outside, hungry and unforgiving. The days that followed bled into one another, a seamless gray tapestry of pain and shivering. The fever took Emma and pulled her under, into a world of burning heat and fractured memories. Time lost its shape. There was only the throbbing of her leg, a relentless drumbeat of agony, and the suffocating weight of the buffalo hide. She was adrift in a dark, hot sea, and the only anchor was the man who moved through the shadows of the cabin like a silent guardian. Luke became a creature of routine, a steady presence in her delirium. She was vaguely aware of the rhythmic thud of a pestle in a small stone mortar as he crushed dried herbs, the sharp, medicinal scent filling the small space. He would boil them into a bitter brew that he would patiently spoon between her chapped lips, his large, rough hand cradling the back of her head. He kept a fire going day and night, a constant, hungry thing that consumed the wood he had stacked against the wall. When she shivered, he added another log. When the heat consumed her, he would dip a rag into a bucket of snowmelt and lay the shocking cold of it across her forehead, her neck, the insides of her wrists. Through the long nights, her delirium gave voice to the ghosts that haunted her. She was no longer in the quiet mountain cabin, but trapped again in the past, a prisoner of moments she had tried to bury. She was a girl of 19, standing in her father's dusty parlor, the smell of stale whiskey thick in the air. She saw his face, not with the fondness of a daughter, but with the cold clarity of a traded commodity. His eyes, normally weak and watery, were shifty, unable to meet hers. He was talking about ledgers and debts, about a man of good standing in a town called Silver Creek. He spoke of it as an opportunity, a fine match, but his words were thin, brittle things that could not conceal the ugly truth beneath. He had gambled away their last dollar, their last acre, and finally, he had gambled her. The dream would shift, and she would be in the back of a wagon, jolting over a rutted road. A man she did not know, a deputy of her husband-to-be, sat opposite her, his face impassive. The bridal dress, a gift from her purchaser, was a cage of stiff lace and tight seams, the whalebone stays digging into her ribs with every bump. It was a dress for a doll, not a living, breathing woman. Her feet, crammed into new leather boots that were a size too small, were a mass of raw, weeping blisters. She was crying silently, the tears tracking through the road dust on her cheeks, mourning a life she had not even had a chance to live. In the grip of these nightmares, she would thrash and murmur, her voice a raw, pleading whisper. The words were always the same, a desperate litany of fear. "Please, don't hurt me. I can't walk." One night, as she repeated the phrase, her voice thick with a terror that was both old and new, Luke was sitting at the table, mending a tear in his leather gloves. He heard her words, the same ones she had spoken when he had first found her in the snow, and a stillness came over him. The needle stopped in midair. The sound was a ghost in the room, a perfect echo of her desperate plea in the frozen dusk. A muscle tightened in his jaw. His face, already a mask of stoicism, seemed to harden further, as if chiseled from stone. He set the glove down with a slow, deliberate motion, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the cabin. Closing the door softly behind him, he stood in the biting cold, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his expression haunted by a sorrow that her words had unearthed from a deep and desolate place. The fever broke on the fourth day. Emma woke to a world that was blessedly clear. The pain in her leg a dull, manageable ache instead of a raging fire. She felt weak, hollowed out, but she was herself again. As she lay there, gathering her strength, she became aware of a new sound, or rather, the lack of one. The relentless wind that had been a constant companion had died. In its place was a profound, muffled silence. She pushed herself up on her elbows and looked at the cabin's single window. It was completely white. Luke came in then, shaking snow from his coat. "It started yesterday," he said, answering her unasked question. "A blizzard. We are not going anywhere for a while." For a week, the world beyond their door ceased to exist. The snow fell in a thick, ceaseless curtain, piling in great drifts against the cabin walls, burying them in a tomb of white. The temperature plummeted. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that seeped through the chinks in the log walls, relentless and hungry. The firewood ran out on the third day. Luke did not hesitate. He took his axe to one of the two chairs at the table, split it into kindling, and fed it to the fire. The next day, the table followed. They were burning the meager furniture of his life to stay alive. In this forced, silent intimacy, Emma began to see the man behind the intimidating facade. His silence was not one of anger or judgment, but of a deep, abiding stillness. It was the quiet of the mountains themselves, vast and ancient. She saw the softness in him in the small, unspoken gestures, the way he would add a spoonful of precious molasses to her broth to give her strength, the way he redressed the bandage on her leg each morning, his touch firm but surprisingly gentle, his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he would sit for hours, carving a piece of wood with his knife, not looking at her, but always aware of her, his body angled as if to shield her from the cold that crept from the corners of the room. He never asked her for anything, not even for thanks. He simply did what needed to be done. He was a man who had stripped his life down to the essentials of survival. And now, he had included her in that stark equation. In the quiet, she began to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. One night, the storm was raging at its peak, the wind shrieking like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin. The fire, fed by the last of the table legs, cast a warm, flickering glow. A small bubble of life in the vast, frozen emptiness. They had eaten a thin soup of salted meat and dried beans. Emma felt stronger than she had in days. The silence between them felt different tonight, heavier with unspoken questions. "You never talk about your past," she said softly, her voice startling in the quiet. Luke looked up from the fire. His eyes, in the dancing light, were deep and shadowed. He did not answer immediately. He stared into the flames, as if seeing something there that only he could see. She thought he would ignore her, retreat back into his fortress of silence. But then he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "There is not much to tell that is worth the breath." "Please," she whispered, "I would like to know." He was quiet for another long moment, and then he let out a slow sigh, a sound of profound weariness, as if the act of remembering was a physical burden. "I was a soldier," he began, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "Fought in the wars, saw things a man ought not to see, did things, too. When it was over, I could not stomach the towns, the noise, the people all pretending the world was a decent place. I took to trapping, living out on the plains." He paused, and she could see a flicker of some other emotion in his eyes, something that was not just weariness, but a distant, painful memory of warmth. "I met a woman there," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "A Cheyenne woman. Her name was Nakoa. It means spirit. And she was full of life, like a river in the spring. She taught me the ways of the mountains, how to listen to the wind, how to find medicine in the plants. We were married in the way of her people." He fell silent, and Emma could almost see her, this spirit woman. In the flickering firelight, she could feel the depth of his loss a vast, empty space in the center of him. "What happened to her?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luke's face hardened, the lines around his eyes deepening. The memory of warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, hard bitterness. "We came to a town not unlike Silver Creek. We thought to trade some furs, buy some supplies. It was a dry year. The crops were failing, the wells were low. The people were afraid, and fear makes people stupid and cruel." He finally tore his gaze from the fire and looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes was so intense it was like a physical blow. They saw her, a Cheyenne woman, with her dark skin and her strange ways. They started to whisper. They said she was a witch, that she had cursed the town with the drought. The preacher fanned the flames, talking of devils and heathens. One day, while I was out checking my trap lines, they took her, a mob, led by the town's most righteous men. They dragged her to the old cottonwood tree at the edge of town, and they hanged her. The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. There was nothing to say. No words of comfort could touch a wound that deep, that terrible. "I came back to find the whole town watching," he continued, his voice a dead, flat monotone. "Watching her hang there. Some of them were smiling. They thought they had saved themselves. The rain came 2 days later. They called it a miracle." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if they were foreign objects. "I left that place. I left all places like it. I learned that day that there is no justice. There is no God. There are just men, and the evil they do when they are scared. I came here, to these mountains, because they do not lie. The cold will kill you. The wolves will eat you. But they do not pretend to be righteous while they are doing it." The cabin was utterly silent. Save for the howl of the wind, Luke had bared the raw, gaping wound at the center of his soul. Emma felt a profound need to offer something in return, to show him that he was not alone in his brokenness. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I cannot have children," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones. She did not cry. The shame was an old, familiar coat she had worn for years. "The doctor told me when I was 17, a fever I had as a girl. It burned something out of me. That is why my father had to sell me. A bride who cannot provide an heir is not worth much of a dowry." She said it plainly, without emotion, just a flat statement of fact. It was the deepest source of her shame, the mark of her failure as a woman in a world that valued her for little else. She waited for his reaction, for the pity, or worse, the revulsion. Luke stared at her for a long time. His dark eyes searched her face, and for the first time, she did not look away. He was seeing her, all of her, with her scars and her shame laid bare. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, almost a whisper. "Maybe that is not the worst thing." The words were a release. They were an absolution she had never known she needed. He did not see her as damaged goods. He did not see her as a failure. He saw her, and in his eyes, she was still whole. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Later that night, the fire had burned low. Luke was asleep in his chair, his head slumped to his chest. Emma, needing to sit up, pushed herself forward with her arms. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she faltered, her hand slipping on the buffalo hide. Before she could fall back, his hand was there, closing around her arm, steadying her. His touch was warm and solid, his grip sure. His eyes were open, alert, as if he had never been asleep at all. She looked at his hand on her arm, at the way his calloused fingers wrapped around her skin. It was a simple, protective touch, with no other meaning behind it, but it was the first gentle touch from a man she had felt in longer than she could remember. She did not pull away. She leaned into his strength for a moment, gathering herself. Outside, A wolf howled, its lonely call a mournful cry against the storm. But inside the small, snow-bound cabin, a different kind of warmth was spreading from the dying embers of the fire. It was the warmth of two broken souls, finding a fragile shelter in the quiet trust of one another. The silence came first. For a week, the world had been a symphony of shrieking wind and the hiss of driven snow. Then, one morning, Emma woke to a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. The light coming through the single, snow-caked window was different, a soft, diffused blue, pure and clean. The storm was over. Later that day, Luke pushed the cabin door open against a wall of snow, the muscles in his back bunching with the effort. A blast of frigid, clean air washed into the stuffy warmth of the cabin. The light that poured in was blinding, a brilliant, painful white that made Emma throw a hand over her eyes. "It is time for some air," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He had spent the morning working. His hands, which he was beginning to realize were never truly idle, busy with purpose. He had taken the runners from a broken crate and fashioned a small, rough sled, padding it with a spare blanket. He came to her bed, his expression as unreadable as ever, and lifted her, blanket and all, with a practiced ease that no longer startled her. He carried her outside and settled her onto the sled as gently as if she were made of spun glass. The world that met her was breathtaking. Every surface was draped in a thick, immaculate blanket of white. The snow clung to the branches of the pines, bowing them low. The sky was a vast, aching blue, and the sun, a pale winter disk, cast long, sharp shadows across the valley. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, and it carried the clean, resinous scent of pine. After the dim, smoky confines of the cabin, the sheer scale of the light in the space was overwhelming. She had been in a tomb, and now she was reborn into a world scrubbed clean. A sob caught in her throat, and then another. She began to weep, not from sadness or pain, but from a profound, shattering relief. She was alive. Luke stood beside the sled, his back to her, granting her the dignity of her tears. His dark shape, a silent, solitary guardian in the vast, white wilderness. While they were entombed in the mountains, the world below had not been still. In the muddy, half-frozen streets of Silver Creek, word had spread. The wagon carrying the new bride for Silas Croft, the town's most prosperous merchant, had never arrived. At first, it was dismissed as a delay due to weather, but as days turned into a week, a grim certainty settled over the town. A small, informal search found the wreckage, the body of the driver, and the looted cargo of the bride, Emma, and Croft's man. There was no sign, save for a few tracks leading off into the high country, quickly obliterated by the blizzard. Silas Croft had a younger brother, Bartholomew, a man whose pride was as vast as his temper. He saw the disappearance not as a tragedy, but as a personal affront, a stain on the family name. A Croft possession had been stolen, a Croft employee murdered. He did not care about the woman, the mail-order bride his brother had purchased like a side of beef. He cared about the insult. He rode through the town, his face a thundercloud, gathering a posse of men fueled by whiskey and the promise of a reward. They were not a search party. They were a hunting party, and their quarry was whoever had dared to cross a Croft. Emma knew nothing of this. Her world had shrunk to the 20 square feet of the cabin and the slow, arduous task of reclaiming her own body. The healing of her leg was a brutal education in the limits of flesh and bone. Every day was a battle. Luke would help her to the edge of the bed, his hands firm on her waist and shoulders. "Stand," he would say, his voice an implacable command. The first time she tried to put weight on the leg, a bolt of lightning shot from her ankle to her hip, and she collapsed against him with a cry, her vision going black at the edges. He did not let her fall. He held her weight, his body a solid wall, until the wave of pain subsided. "Again," he said. And so it went. Every day, she would stand, trembling, her teeth gritted against the fire in her leg, her knuckles white where she gripped his arm. She would take a single, shuffling step, then two. Sometimes she would make it to the door before the muscles spasmed and gave out. He was an unrelenting taskmaster, yet his patience was infinite. He never showed frustration, never pushed her beyond what she could bear, but he never let her give up, either. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw when she was in pain, the almost imperceptible nod of approval when she managed one more step than the day before. He was a man who spoke in actions, and his actions told her that he believed she could heal. But they both knew the truth. The leg was setting crooked. She would walk again, but she would carry a limp, a permanent, physical reminder of her ordeal for the rest of her days. In the evenings, as the fire crackled and the shadows grew long, they would talk, or rather, she would talk, and he would listen. The solitude and his quiet, non-judgmental presence created a space where she could finally unpack the heavy baggage of her life. She told him about her father, not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity for his weakness. She spoke of the quiet shame that had followed her since she was a girl. The shame of her barrenness in a world where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could produce. "It makes you feel like a broken vessel," she confessed one night, staring into the flames. "Something to be discarded because it cannot perform its function." Luke was silent for a long time, whittling a piece of pine, the shavings falling in a neat pile at his feet. "Some men see women as vessels," he said finally, his eyes not leaving his work, "or as property, or as a means to an end. Those men are fools. They look at a woman and see only what she can do for them. They do not see the woman herself." His words resonated with the story he had told her of Nakoa, of the men who had looked at her and seen only a witch, a scapegoat for their own fears. She and his lost wife, she realized, were sisters under the skin, both victims of the casual cruelty of men who saw them as less than human. A strange and powerful bond was forming between them in the firelight, a bond forged in shared pain and a mutual understanding of the world's injustices. One afternoon, Emma woke from a nap to the sound of a saw. She hobbled to the door, using a rough crutch Luke had carved for her, and looked out. He was at the edge of the woods, sawing thick planks from a fallen pine. For the next several days, he worked tirelessly. He built a ramp of packed earth and smooth wood that led from the ground to the cabin's raised doorway. She watched him, a knot of familiar shame tightening in her chest. She was a burden, a cripple he had to make accommodations for. "You do not have to do that," she said one evening, her voice tight. He did not stop his work, which was now focused on constructing a strange, low seat with wooden wheels. "It will make things easier," he said, without looking up. "I am a weight on you. Luke, you saved me, and now I am just here, in your way." He finally stopped his work and turned to face her. He walked over, wiping the sawdust from his hands onto his trousers. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch the corners of his mouth, a subtle crinkling at the edges of his eyes. "You are not in my way, Emma," he said, his voice softer than usual. "And it is good to have something to build that is not a wall." The simple sincerity of his words disarmed her. He was not just building for her. He was building for himself, a way out of the fortress of solitude he had constructed around his heart. The shame inside her loosened its grip, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest. The nights grew colder, and they fell into a comfortable domestic rhythm. She would mend his clothes while he cleaned his rifle. She learned to cook on the hearth, making stews from the salted meat and dried vegetables he had stored. He taught her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to identify the tracks of deer and coyote in the snow. They were two solitary people, learning to share a space, their silences as comfortable as their conversations. One night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The fire had burned low, and the only light came from the glowing embers. Emma had been watching him as he sat across from her, his face a mask of shadow and light, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. She knew where they were. They were with her, the spirit woman who had taught him how to live in these mountains. She stood, her limp more pronounced now that she was tired, and walked the few steps to his chair. He looked up, his eyes questioning. She did not speak. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and laid it against his cheek. His beard was rough beneath her palm, but his skin was warm. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a crossing of a boundary that had until now been sacred. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply watched her, his breath held. "Do you still think about her?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his features. He leaned into her touch, a small, involuntary movement. He opened his eyes again, and they were filled with a deep, ancient sorrow, but also with a startling clarity. He nodded. "Every morning," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "When the sun hits that ridge over there, that is where I buried her." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But when I look at you, it does not ache as bad." His confession was a key, unlocking something deep within her. He was not replacing his wife. He was finding a way to live with the pain, and she was a part of that healing. She leaned down, her heart hammering against her ribs, and gently pressed her lips to his. The kiss was shy, uncertain, a question more than a statement. It was a trembling exploration, the first touch of a person learning to feel again. His lips were chapped and firm beneath hers. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, as if startled, and then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he responded. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, and he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a desperate, soul-deep need. It was the kiss of two survivors, clinging to each other in the dark. He broke the kiss and rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, asking a question he could not put into words. She answered with a slight nod, a silent giving of a permission she had never thought she would have the right to give. He stood and lifted her into his arms, carrying her the few steps to the bed. He laid her down on the buffalo hide, his movements slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Their lovemaking was a reflection of everything that had passed between them. It was slow and careful, a quiet conversation spoken in the language of touch. There was a hesitancy to it, an awareness of the scars, both visible and hidden, that they both carried. His hands explored her body not with lust, but with a kind of gentle wonder, as if he were memorizing the map of her. He was careful of her injured leg, his tenderness a balm on the old wounds of her heart. There were long silences, filled only with the sound of their breathing and the crackle of the embers. In those silences, they saw each other. They saw the broken parts, the shame, the grief, and they did not turn away. Beneath the care and the caution, there was a raw, undeniable need, the desperate hunger of two lonely people who had finally found a safe harbor. For Emma, it was a reclamation. Her body, which had been a source of pain, a commodity to be sold, a vessel to be judged, was suddenly her own again, a source of pleasure and connection. Afterward, as she lay curled against his side, his arm a heavy, protective weight around her, the tears came again. They were not the tears of release she had shed in the snow, but something deeper, more profound. They were quiet tears, slipping from the corners of her eyes and tracing paths into her hair. Luke felt her body shaking with silent sobs and shifted, propping himself up on an elbow to look down at her, his face etched with concern. "Did I hurt you?" he whispered, his voice rough with fear. She shook her head, a watery smile touching her lips. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It is not pain." She took a shaky breath, finally putting a name to the feeling that was overwhelming her. It was release. It was hope. I thought I was too broken for this." The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered by the bark of a dog. It was not a wolf's howl, but the sharp, domesticated sound of the world below, a sound that did not belong in their quiet valley. Luke was instantly still, his hand freezing on the axe handle he was mending. He rose without a sound and moved to the cabin door, peering through a small crack. Emma, who had been kneading a small lump of dough, felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. A man on a tired-looking sorrel was picking his way through the snow, following the half-hidden trail Luke's trips for firewood had made. He wore the gear of a ranch hand, but he rode with a swagger that spoke of something else, a hired confidence. He reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the new ramp, the sled, the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, his voice loud and rough. "Looking for the Croft woman. We heard a squatter took her up this way." Luke stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. He did not have his rifle, but his sheer size and the granite stillness of his posture were weapons in themselves. "There is no one here by that name," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. The rider smirked, a flash of yellowed teeth. "Is that so? Big fella like you, all alone in the mountains. We tracked you from the wreck. Now, be a good man and send out the merchandise. Mr. Bartholomew Croft is anxious to have his brother's property returned." The word property hung in the air, an obscenity. Emma felt a surge of hot, defiant anger. She moved to stand behind Luke, her hand resting on the doorframe, letting the man see her. She saw his eyes flicker with recognition, then slide over her with a crude, assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. "She is not property," Luke said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And you are not welcome here. Turn your horse and ride out." "I do not think so," the rider said, shifting his weight in the saddle, his hand drifting casually toward the pistol on his hip. "I have a duty to—" He never finished the sentence. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur. Luke stepped back into the cabin and emerged a second later with his rifle. The sound of him cocking the hammer was a sharp, metallic click that echoed in the vast silence of the valley. It was the sound of a final, non-negotiable argument. The rider's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty white. He looked from the unwavering black hole of the rifle's muzzle to the cold, dead certainty in Luke's eyes. He slowly raised his hands, palms out. "No need for that," he stammered. "Just doing a job." "Your job is done," Luke said. "Leave, now, and do not come back. If I see you, or any man like you, on this mountain again, I will not give a second warning." The man needed no further encouragement. He wheeled his horse around so fast the animal skittered in the snow and spurred it back down the trail, not once looking back. Emma watched him go, her heart hammering. The bubble of their quiet world had been irrevocably burst. The town knew she was alive. It did not take long. 2 days later, 2 more riders appeared. This time, they stopped at the edge of the clearing, keeping a respectful distance. One wore the tarnished star of the town's sheriff, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes. The other was a preacher, a thin, severe man in a black coat, who held his Bible as if it were a shield. "Luke," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying on the still air. "Sheriff Thompson, I need to have a word." Luke stepped out, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Emma followed, using her crutch, and stood beside him. She would not hide. This was her fight, too. "We have had a complaint sworn against you," the sheriff said, his eyes flicking from Luke to Emma and back again. "From Bartholomew Croft. He claims you abducted this woman, his brother's intended bride. and are holding her against her will. He also claims," the sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable, "that you have defiled her." The preacher, Reverend Miller, stepped forward, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "We have come to take this poor, fallen woman back to the safety and decency of a Christian town," he declared, his voice ringing with sanctimony. "She needs guidance, and you, sir, need to answer for your sins." Emma felt a surge of fury so powerful it almost choked her. They saw a fallen woman, a victim, a soiled object to be reclaimed and cleansed. They did not see her at all. Before Luke could speak, she took a step forward, her crutch sinking into the snow. "No one is holding me against my will," she said, her voice shaking but firm, carrying farther than she thought it could. "And no one has defiled me. The men who robbed our wagon left me for dead in the snow with a broken leg. I would be a frozen corpse right now if it were not for this man." She gestured with her head toward Luke. "He did not kidnap me. He saved me." The sheriff looked at her, at the makeshift splint on her leg, the pallor still clinging to her skin, and his expression softened with a flicker of pity. "Ma'am, you have been through a terrible ordeal. You are likely not thinking clearly. Mr. Croft is a respected man in Silver Creek. He will see you are cared for." "Cared for?" Emma laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Like a piece of the livestock? I was sold to Silas Croft by my father. That is the truth of it. I was never asked. I was property then, and I am not property now. I am not going back." The preacher's face hardened. The girl is clearly confused. "Sheriff, she has been in the sway of this savage lover. We all remember his last dalliance with a heathen." The insult, so casually cruel, landed like a physical blow. Emma saw Luke's knuckles whiten on the stock of his rifle. The air crackled with a sudden, deadly tension. "You will watch your tongue, preacher," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet, "or I will cut it out for you." The preacher took a step back, his bravado failing in the face of such raw menace. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Luke, do not make this harder than it has to be," he said. "The law is the law. She is betrothed to a Croft. You have no claim on her." "I claim nothing," Luke said. "She is a free woman. She makes her own choice." He looked down at Emma, his eyes asking a silent question. "I am staying here," she said, looking directly at the sheriff. "This is my choice. You will have to kill me to take me from this mountain." Sheriff Thompson stared at her for a long moment, then at the unwavering rifle in Luke's hands. He was a man who knew how to measure a situation, and he could see that this one was a powder keg with a very short fuse. He shook his head slowly. "This is not over," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned his horse. "Come on, Reverend. There is nothing more to be done here today." They rode away, leaving a trail of poison in the clean mountain air. The whispers they had brought with them from the town seemed to linger, ugly and venomous. "Savage lover, fallen woman, ruined." They were branding irons, meant to sear them both with the town's judgment. That night, Emma could not be still. The injustice of it churned inside her. They had been tried and convicted without a trial, their story rewritten to fit the town's prejudices. "They will not stop," she said, pacing the small cabin, her limp a frantic, uneven rhythm. "The Crofts are powerful men. They will not let this go." "We will be ready for them," Luke said, cleaning his rifle with a methodical, deadly calm. "No," she said, stopping in front of him. "Fighting them with guns is not the answer. That is your way. Luke, to retreat, to answer violence with violence. But they are not just attacking you. They are attacking me. They are stealing my name, my story, and I will not let them." A fierce, unfamiliar determination was hardening inside her. "I will not hide up here like a criminal. I am going down there. I am going to speak to them." Luke looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. "Emma, that is foolish. They will not listen. They have already made up their minds." "Then I will make them unmake them," she insisted, her chin set. "I will go to the one place they all gather to judge each other. I am going to stand up in that church on Sunday, and I'm going to tell them the truth." He argued with her, his voice tight with a fear for her that he could not otherwise express. He spoke of the town's cruelty, of the mob mentality that had taken Nakoa from him. But she was immovable. This was not something he could protect her from. This was a battle she had to fight for herself, with the only weapon she had, her voice. Sunday morning was cold and bright. Luke drove her down the mountain in a small buckboard he had borrowed from a trapper. He did not speak the whole way, his face grim, his rifle resting on the seat beside him. When they reached Silver Creek, the townspeople stopped and stared. They pointed and whispered as Luke helped her down from the wagon. The words followed them like a cloud of insects. "There he is, the savage lover. And that is the harlot. Look at her, brazen as you please." Emma ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the tall, white spire of the church. Every step on her crutches was an agony, both for her leg and for her pride. Luke walked beside her, a silent, formidable shadow. His presence a dare to anyone who thought to get too close. They entered the church just as the opening hymn was ending. A collective gasp went through the congregation. All heads turned. The pews were filled with the faces of her judges. Bartholomew Croft in the front row, his face purple with rage. Reverend Miller at the pulpit, his mouth a thin, disapproving line. Sheriff Thompson in the back, his expression unreadable. Emma did not hesitate, leaning heavily on her crutches. She began the slow, painful walk down the central aisle. The only sounds were the tap-tap thump of her crutches on the wooden floor and the rustle of 100 people shifting in their seats. Luke remained at the back, by the door, his arms crossed, his eyes missing nothing. She stopped at the front of the church, directly before the pulpit. She turned to face the congregation, her breath coming in ragged gasps from the effort. Her hands, gripping the crutches, were trembling, but she held her head high. She met the hostile, curious, and pitying gazes of the townspeople. She took a deep, steadying breath. "My name is Emma," she began, her voice shaking but carrying through the cavernous silence. "Most of you know me only as the bride, the property of Silas Croft." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You have been told that I was kidnapped, that I was defiled. You have been told a story that makes you comfortable." She looked directly at Bartholomew Croft. "The truth is, I was sold. My father sold me to your brother to pay a debt. I was cargo, delivered to this town, and when that cargo was attacked, I was left behind, left to die in a blizzard, with a shattered leg. No one from this town, no one from the respected Croft family, came looking for me until they thought their property had been stolen." Her voice grew stronger with every word, fueled by the fire of her conviction. "The man you call a savage lover found me. He carried me to shelter. He set my leg. He nursed me through a fever that should have killed me. He saved my life." She pushed herself up straighter, her eyes sweeping over the silent faces. "You have judged him for his past. You have judged me for my present. You call him a sinner and you call me ruined. But the only sin I see is a town that would leave a woman to die in the snow. And the only ruin I see is a society that believes a woman is something to be bought and sold." She took another shaky breath, gathering herself for her final declaration. "I was sold. I was left. He saved me, and I choose him." A profound, stunned silence fell over the church. No one moved. No one spoke. Emma had taken their narrative and shattered it, leaving them with the jagged, uncomfortable pieces of the truth. She stood there for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air, a final, defiant testament. Then, she slowly turned and began the long walk back up the aisle. The silence held until she reached the door where Luke was waiting. And then, from outside, came the sharp, violent sound of shattering glass. Someone had hurled a rock through one of the church's stained glass windows. It was the town's answer, a cowardly, anonymous act of violence, a refusal to accept the truth she had offered them. They did not need to speak of it. They both knew there was no place for them here. That afternoon, they decided to leave. Luke began to prepare the buckboard for a long journey, packing supplies, food, and the few possessions he had. Emma was determined. "I will not be carried out of this valley like an invalid," she told him. "When we leave, I will walk to that wagon on my own legs." That night, their last night in the cabin, the air was heavy with the weight of their departure. The moon was a bright, cold sliver in the dark sky. After they had finished their packing, Luke took her hand. "There is one more place we need to go," he said. He led her out of the cabin and up the steep ridge behind it. The walk was difficult for her, but she did not complain. At the top of the ridge, under a solitary, wind-twisted pine, was a small, unassuming pile of stones. It was a grave, unmarked, but tended with care. This was Nakoa's place. Luke knelt beside the stones, his large hand coming to rest on the cold, smooth surface of the largest one. He was silent for a long time, his head bowed. Emma knelt beside him, giving him the space for his grief, for his memories. "This is Emma," he said finally, his voice thick and low, speaking to the stones, to the wind, to the spirit of the woman who lay beneath them. "I wanted you to know." It was a simple introduction, an offering of peace, a bridging of the two halves of his heart. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. For him, for the woman he had lost, for the strange, painful, beautiful path that had led her to this moment. She placed her hand over his on the cold stone. "You do not have to stop loving her," she whispered, her voice a soft counterpoint to the sigh of the wind in the pine. "Just love me, too." They traveled south, away from the jagged peaks and the bitter memories of Silver Creek. The journey was slow, dictated by the pace of the tired horse and the throbbing in Emma's leg. They were a strange sight, a large, silent man with Apache braids, and a pale woman who walked with a pronounced limp, their meager possessions piled in the back of a rickety buckboard. They spoke little, but a new, quiet understanding flowed between them. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were partners in a silent exodus, leaving the world that had judged them behind in a cloud of dust. After 2 weeks on the road, they came upon a small village nestled in a shallow, green valley. It was called Harmony Creek, a name that seemed like a prayer. It was not a boomtown, just a handful of simple, whitewashed buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a few scattered homesteads. There was no pretense here, no wealthy merchant class to pass judgment. The people they passed on the single dusty street were farmers and ranchers, their faces weathered by sun and hard work. They looked at the newcomers with a mild, rural curiosity, but not with the sharp, suspicious glare they had left behind. No one knew their names, no one knew their story. They were a blank slate. "This place," Emma said softly, her eyes scanning the peaceful valley, the creek that glittered in the afternoon sun. "This place feels quiet." Luke nodded, his gaze sweeping the landscape with a practiced eye. "There is a spring-fed creek to the south, good water, good land." They filed a claim on 160 acres of rolling grassland bordered by the creek on one side and a stand of cottonwoods on the other. It was a raw, untamed piece of earth, but it was theirs, with the last of their money. They bought tools, a plow, and sacks of seed potatoes, corn, and beans at the general store. The storekeeper, a balding man named Jedediah, was friendly enough, asking no questions, simply weighing their goods and wishing them luck. Their new life was built from the ground up, with sweat and aching muscles. They lived out of the back of the wagon for the first month while Luke, with a raw, focused energy, built them a new cabin. It was larger than his old one. With 2 rooms and a proper stone hearth he built with rocks hauled from the creek bed. He worked from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic sound of his axe and hammer a constant, reassuring presence. While he built the walls of their home, Emma claimed a patch of rich, dark earth near the spring and began to build her garden. Her leg made the work excruciating. She could not kneel for long, so she spent hours sitting on a low stool, breaking up the soil with a hand trowel. Her face beaded with sweat. Luke watched her, his expression a mixture of concern and a deep, quiet respect. He never offered to do the work for her. He understood, without her having to say a word, that this garden was hers. It was a place where she, a woman who had been told her body was barren, could bring forth life from the soil. She taught him things he did not know. He could track a deer for 20 miles and build a shelter from nothing, but he knew little of the patient, hopeful work of cultivation. She showed him how to plant the corn in rows, how to hill the potatoes, how to coax the delicate bean tendrils to climb up a lattice of sticks. He was a surprisingly gentle student, his large, calloused hands learning to handle the tiny seeds with a delicate touch. In turn, he used his skills to shape their world to her needs. He built the furniture for the new cabin himself. The kitchen table was a fraction lower than standard, so she could sit and work without straining. The chair he built for her was solid and sturdy, with wide armrests that she could use to push herself up. Every object he crafted was an unspoken act of love, an acknowledgement of her body and its limitations, but also a testament to her strength. He was not fixing her. He was making a world where she could be whole. They carved out a life that was hard and honest. Their days were filled with the relentless labor of the frontier, but their nights were filled with a quiet, growing tenderness. A set of rituals began to form, a silent language of care that bound them closer than any vows. Every night, after their simple meal, he would heat water on the hearth and soak a strip of clean flannel. He would kneel before her and gently wrap the warm cloth around her bad leg, his touch firm and soothing, easing the ache that settled in her bones at the end of a long day. As he tended to her leg, she would undo his long braids, her fingers combing through the thick, dark strands of his hair, her touch a soft counterpoint to his. Sometimes, she would re-braid it for him, her hands moving in a slow, rhythmic dance, a gesture of intimacy that was more profound than any kiss. In this quiet, peaceful valley, something began to unthaw in both of them. One afternoon, as Luke was trying to fix a wobbly wheel on the buckboard, he hit his thumb with the hammer. He let out a string of curses that was so inventive and heartfelt that Emma, who was hanging laundry on a line, burst out laughing. It was the first time he had heard her truly laugh, a full, unburdened sound that seemed to sparkle in the sunlit air. He stopped sucking on his thumb and just stared at her, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his own face. Laughter, they were learning, was a language they could both speak. She began to sing again. At first, it was just a low hum as she worked in her garden, old forgotten melodies from her childhood. Then, one evening, as she was mending a shirt by the firelight, she began to sing a soft, sad ballad about a lost love. Luke stopped his whittling and listened, his head cocked to one side. When she finished, the silence in the room was thick with a sweet, melancholy peace. "I have not heard singing in a long time," he said, his voice low and rough. "I had not felt like singing," she answered simply. He looked around the small, sturdy cabin he had built, at the firelight dancing on her face, at the neat rows of vegetables visible through the open door. "I want to build a home for you." "Emma," he said, the words coming out with a sincerity that was almost painful. "A real home." She knew what he meant. Not just a shelter, but a place of safety and belonging, a place where the ghosts of the past could not follow. One sweltering afternoon in late summer, a new figure appeared at the edge of their land. It was a boy, no more than 10 or 11 years old, his clothes little more than rags. his face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. He was rail-thin, with large, haunted eyes that darted around as if he expected a blow to come from any direction. He stood by the creek, watching them, a small, solitary figure of misery. Emma saw him first. Without a word to Luke, she ladled a bowl of the stew she had made for their midday meal and walked slowly toward him. He flinched as she approached, taking a step back, ready to bolt like a frightened deer. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft and calm. "I am not going to hurt you. You look hungry." She set the bowl down on a tree stump and retreated a few paces. The boy watched her, his eyes wide with suspicion. But the smell of the stew, rich with meat and the potatoes from her own garden, was an irresistible siren call. He scurried forward, snatched the bowl, and retreated to the cover of the trees, where he devoured the food with a desperate animal hunger. He told them his name was Daniel. He was a runaway, an orphan who had been indentured to a cruel rancher a few valleys over, a man who worked him from dawn to dusk and beat him for the smallest infraction. He had finally run, sleeping in the woods, eating berries, until he had stumbled upon their homestead. Emma's heart went out to him. She saw in his haunted eyes a reflection of her own past, the same fear and helplessness. She bathed him, dressed him in a pair of Luke's old trousers, cut down and belted with a piece of rope, and gave him a pallet of blankets by the fire. He ate 3 bowls of stew that night and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Luke was more reserved. He watched the boy with a cautious, assessing gaze. He saw the wariness, the ingrained expectation of cruelty. The next morning, he took Daniel out to the small corral where their horse was kept. "You know how to ride?" Luke asked. The boy shook his head, looking down at his bare feet. "It is time you learned," Luke said. He showed the boy how to approach the horse, how to speak to it in a low, calm voice, how to brush its coat. He lifted him onto the horse's bare back and led him around the corral, his large hand resting on the boy's leg, a steady, grounding presence. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Daniel, it turned out, was a quick learner with a desperate desire to be useful. He helped Emma in the garden, his small hands surprisingly deft at pulling weeds. He followed Luke everywhere, a silent shadow, absorbing every lesson about trapping, hunting, and woodwork. He began to lose the haunted look in his eyes, and a bit of a boy's natural mischief began to peek through. They did not speak of his future, or of sending him back. It was an unspoken, unacknowledged fact that he was here to stay. They were, unofficially, a family. One afternoon, Daniel was helping Emma carry a basket of water from the creek. He looked up at her, his face serious. "My ma used to sing that song you sing," he said. The word hung in the air between them. "Ma!" Emma's breath caught in her throat. A feeling so warm and powerful it was almost painful washed over her. It was the feeling of a locked door, a door she thought was rusted shut forever, creaking open in her heart. She could not speak. She simply reached out and rested her hand on his head for a moment, a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. A few weeks later, the moment came that changed everything. Emma was walking back from the garden, her arms full of freshly picked corn. Her bad leg, tired from a long day, suddenly buckled beneath her. She cried out, stumbling, the corn spilling to the ground as she threw her hands out to break her fall. The old, familiar shame washed over her, a hot flush of frustration at the weakness of her own body. But she did not hit the ground. A small, wiry body slammed into her side, an arm wrapping around her waist, straining to hold her up. It was Daniel. He had seen her stumble and had sprinted from the woodpile, catching her just in time. "I got you, Ma!" he panted, his small frame trembling with the effort of holding her weight. "I got you." She leaned on him, her breath catching in a sob. She was not crying from the near fall. or from the pain. She was crying because, in that moment, he had not seen her as a cripple. He had not seen her as a burden or as a broken thing. He had seen his ma, someone he loved, about to fall, and he had done everything in his power to catch her. She was not seen as a collection of broken parts. She was seen as whole. That evening, Luke was quieter than usual. He had seen the incident from the cabin doorway. He had watched as the boy had helped her up, as she had hugged him, her face buried in his hair. He had seen the look on her face when she came inside, a look of radiant, tear-stained peace. After Daniel was asleep on his pallet, Luke sat by the fire, a piece of cottonwood and his whittling knife in his hands. He worked for a long time, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of concentration in the flickering light. When he was finished, he came and sat beside Emma on the bench outside their door. The sky was a vast, dark canvas, peppered with 1,000,000 glittering stars. He took her left hand in his. His was calloused and rough. Hers was soft, the nails stained with the dirt of her garden. He said nothing. He simply slipped a small, wooden ring onto her third finger. It was warm from his hand, carved smooth, the pale wood seeming to glow in the starlight. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion so deep and profound it needed no adornment. "Not bought," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Not traded, not taken." He paused, his thumb stroking her hand. "Chosen." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the stars into a shimmering haze. She leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss of absolute certainty, of a peace so deep it settled into her very bones. He held her close, his arms a safe harbor, a promise of a home she had never dared to dream of. She rested her head on his shoulder, looking out at the vast, starry darkness of the valley they had claimed as their own. "I am not afraid anymore," she whispered, and for the first time in her life, it was the absolute truth. The passing of a full year is a quiet thing in a place like Harmony Creek. It is measured not by a calendar, but by the turning of the earth. It is the greening of the cottonwoods along the creek, the buzz of bees in the summer clover, the first sharp bite of frost on the autumn air, and the deep, muffled silence of the first snow. For Emma, Luke, and Daniel, it was a year of building. They built a barn, a smokehouse, a life. The raw, empty land they had claimed was now a home, etched with the patterns of their daily labor and their quiet, growing affection. But news, like water, always finds a way downstream. A trapper passing through, a freight driver with a loose tongue, a letter sent to the wrong town, slowly, inexorably. Word of the life they were building trickled back to the bitter hills of Silver Creek. The story grew with each telling. The savage lover and his ruined bride were not just surviving, they were thriving. They had land, a new cabin, and had even taken in an orphan boy. They were building a family. For Bartholomew Croft, each piece of news was another turn of the screw, tightening the humiliation that had become a knot of poison in his gut. His brother's name had been sullied, his family's authority challenged and made a mockery of by a crippled woman and a half-wild mountain man. He had been shamed in his own church, the town, while still wary of Luke, had begun to whisper about the Crofts, about the ugliness of a contract that sold a woman like a head of cattle. The shame was intolerable. It demanded retribution. Justice, in his mind, was not a matter for the courts, but a debt to be collected. He hired 2 men, bounty hunters from out of the territory, men with cold eyes and a reputation for finishing a job. No matter how messy, their instructions were simple: bring the woman back and put the man in the ground. The attack came on a cool morning in late autumn. Luke and Daniel were in the woods that bordered their land, checking a line of rabbit snares, while Emma followed a short distance behind, gathering the last of the wild mint that grew near the creek. The air was crisp and clean, the silence broken only by the rustle of dry leaves under their feet. There was no warning. They burst from the trees, Two of them, their faces hard and unshaven. One was a tall, lanky man with a cruel twist to his mouth. The other was short, barrel-chested, and moved with a brutish speed. Luke reacted instantly, a primal roar tearing from his chest. He shoved Daniel behind him, yelling the single word, "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. The barrel-chested man was on him, a long knife flashing in the dappled sunlight. Luke, armed only with the small hatchet he used for clearing brush, met the charge. The sound of their struggle was a terrifying eruption of grunts, curses, and the thud of bodies hitting the frozen ground. The second man, the lankier one, went for Emma. She screamed, her crutch falling from her hand as she scrambled backward. Daniel, his face a mask of terror, stood frozen for a half-second before Emma's voice cut through his fear. "Daniel, hide!" she shrieked, pointing toward a thicket of dense brush. "Go now!" Her command broke his paralysis. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the undergrowth like a frightened rabbit. The man grabbed Emma's arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. "You are coming with us, girlie," he sneered. From the corner of her eye, she saw the glint of the blade as the other man drove it deep into Luke's side. Luke cried out, a sound of pained, furious surprise, and staggered back, his hand flying to the wound. Blood, shockingly red, pulsed between his fingers. The sight of his blood, of his pain, ignited a fire in Emma that burned away every last trace of her fear. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she twisted in the man's grip, bringing her good leg up and kicking him with all her might in the knee. He howled in pain and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She threw herself away from him, stumbling, falling, and then crawling, scrambling through the dirt and leaves toward Luke. The two men, seeing Luke wounded and Emma on the ground, seemed to think the fight was over. "Grab her," the barrel-chested man grunted, clutching his own side where Luke's hatchet had left a shallow gash. But Luke was not finished. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, not at the men, but at the steep, brush-choked ravine that bordered the clearing. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her with him. "The creek!" he gasped, his voice strained. They tumbled down the embankment together, a chaotic avalanche of sliding dirt, rocks and tearing roots, landing in a heap in the shallow, icy water of the creek below. The bounty hunters cursed from the top of the ravine, but they did not follow immediately. The fall had been treacherous, and their quarry was now out of sight. Hidden by the dense undergrowth that lined the creek bed, they would have to find an easier way down. Emma's mind was a maelstrom of terror, but one thought burned clear and bright. She had to get Luke away. He was leaning heavily on her, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood. "Luke, stay with me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She put his arm over her shoulders, taking his weight. Every ounce of her being screamed in protest. Her bad leg was a column of fire, her muscles straining, but she did not falter. She began to drag him down the creek, using the flowing water to hide their tracks, the dense foliage to hide their movements. It was a nightmare of stumbling, agonizing progress. She was no longer a cripple. She was a she-wolf, dragging her wounded mate to the safety of their den. She found a shallow overhang carved out of the creek bank by years of spring floods, hidden behind a curtain of tangled willow branches. It was not much, but it was cover. She managed to get him inside, out of the water, and collapsed beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He was fading. His eyes were glassy, his skin clammy and cold. She tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie a knot. She pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound in his side, trying to staunch the bleeding. He cried out, a low, pained groan. "I am sorry, I am sorry." She wept, the tears she had held back now flowing freely, mingling with the blood on her hands. Luke, please, you cannot leave me. You cannot. She held him, rocking him gently, her mind a frantic prayer. The roles were reversed. She was the caregiver now, the fierce protector against the encroaching darkness. She was tending his wound as he had once tended hers, her touch desperate, her resolve absolute. She would not let the world take another person she loved. She refused. They heard the men crashing through the brush nearby, their voices drawing closer. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. She pressed her hand over Luke's mouth and held her own breath, praying they would not be found. The voices passed their hiding spot and continued down the creek. They were safe, for now, but she knew they would be back. As dusk began to fall, a small, dirt-streaked face peeked through the willow branches. It was Daniel. He had circled around, tracking them with the skills Luke had taught him, his young face a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "They are making a camp," he whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of Luke, pale and still on the ground. "Upstream. They are going to wait until morning to search again." A desperate plan formed in Emma's mind. It was a terrible risk, a heavy burden to place on a child, but it was their only hope. She looked at Daniel, at the boy who called her Ma. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to do something for me. Something very brave. I need you to go for help." She described the way back to Harmony Creek, the landmarks, the quickest route. "Go to the general store. Find Mr. Jedediah. Tell him what happened. Tell him to bring rifles." The boy did not hesitate. He simply nodded, his small face set with a grim purpose. He squeezed her hand, looked one last time at the unconscious form of the man who had taught him to ride, and then slipped away into the twilight, a small, silent ghost on a desperate mission. The night was the longest of Emma's life. She held Luke, sharing her body heat, whispering to him, begging him to hold on. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the branches, she heard the men returning. Her blood ran cold. She had no weapon, no way to fight. All she could do was make herself a shield, to place her body between Luke and the men who had come to kill him. The lanky man was the first to tear aside the willow branches. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face when he saw them. Well, look what we have here. Nowhere left to run." But as he and his partner stepped forward, another sound broke the morning stillness. It was the sound of hoofbeats, of many horses, coming fast. And then, a voice, calm and steady, but carrying the unmistakable ring of authority. "That is far enough." Jedediah, the storekeeper, stood at the edge of the creek, a Winchester rifle held steady in his hands. Behind him were a half-dozen other men from Harmony Creek, farmers, the blacksmith, men she recognized from their infrequent trips to the village. They were not lawmen, but they were decent men, and they had answered the call. The bounty hunters froze, their expressions shifting from triumph to disbelief, and then to cornered rage. For a moment, it seemed violence would erupt again, but the sight of 7 rifles, all aimed with a steady, practiced calm, was a powerful deterrent. They slowly raised their hands. The journey to the next town, the county seat where a circuit judge held court, was a blur for Emma. Luke, barely conscious, was transported in a makeshift litter. She never left his side. The courtroom was a large, drafty hall, filled with curious townspeople. Bartholomew Croft was there, his face a mask of arrogant certainty, his high-priced lawyer beside him. But the circuit judge was not the crony he had been expecting. Judge Eleanor Morrison was a woman in her 50s, one of the first female judges in the territory, known for her sharp mind and her even sharper sense of justice. The proceedings were swift. Bartholomew's lawyer painted a picture of a virtuous family trying to rescue a deluded woman from the clutches of a violent, half-savage kidnapper. Then, Judge Morrison called Emma to the stand. She walked slowly, her limp more pronounced than ever. But her head was held high. She did not speak of love, or of the life they had built. She spoke of facts. She held up the original bridal contract, the one her father had signed, and she read it aloud. Her voice did not waver as she read the cold, clinical language, the clauses that listed her as a consignment, that stipulated her duties, that detailed the payment that had been made for her. She read the price of a human soul. "This document," she said, her voice ringing with a clear, irrefutable power, "is not a marriage agreement. It is a bill of sale. I was not a bride. I was an acquisition. The Croft family was not rescuing a loved one. They were recovering an investment." She looked directly at the judge. "The only crime committed here was the one that happened long before I ever met Luke, the crime of treating a human being as property." Judge Morrison listened to every word, her expression unreadable. When Emma was finished, a silence fell over the courtroom. The judge looked at the contract, then at Bartholomew Croft, whose face had gone a blotchy, furious red. Her ruling was swift and decisive. The bridal contract was declared null and void, an illegal indenture. The bounty hunters were sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for attempted murder. And then, she turned her gaze on Bartholomew Croft. She could not charge him with a crime, but her words were a sentence in themselves. She spoke of the law, of decency, and of the shame a town should feel when its leading citizens behave with such brutal, mercenary arrogance. Bartholomew Croft left the courtroom a diminished man, followed by the scornful whispers of his own people. Back in Harmony Creek, Luke began the slow, arduous process of healing. The knife had missed anything vital, but the wound was deep, and the loss of blood had left him weak as a newborn. Emma nursed him with a fierce, unwavering devotion. The boy, Daniel, was a constant, helpful presence, fetching water, feeding the chickens, and sitting for hours by Luke's bedside, as if his presence alone could ward off any lingering shadows. Emma would read to Luke in the long afternoons, her voice a low, steady murmur, a soothing salve on his pain. She read from the Bible, from almanacs, from a tattered copy of Shakespeare she had found at the general store. The words did not matter as much as the sound of her voice, a constant, reassuring presence in the quiet room. Spring came, and with it, life returned to the valley. The creek swelled with snowmelt. The pastures turned a vibrant, impossible green. And the first tender shoots began to poke through the dark soil of Emma's garden. One afternoon, the first truly warm day of the year, Luke was finally strong enough to walk outside. He leaned on her as they walked slowly to the garden. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and new beginnings. They stood for a long time, looking at the neat rows, at the promise of the coming harvest. She gripped his hand, her fingers twining with his. "You brought me back," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She meant from the snow, from the fever, from the brink of death, but she also meant from a life of shame and fear. He turned to her, his dark eyes clear and filled with a love that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. He gently kissed her brow. "You made me want to come back," he answered. He meant from the wilderness of his grief, from the fortress of solitude he had built around his heart. Later that evening, the three of them sat together under the big cottonwood tree by the creek. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. Daniel, tired from a day of running and playing, had fallen asleep, his head resting in Emma's lap. She stroked his hair, her fingers tracing the curve of his cheek. She leaned her head back against Luke's shoulder, his arm coming around her, holding her close. They sat in a comfortable, perfect silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. They were three scarred, broken people who had found a way to make each other whole. They were safe. They were home. They were a family. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel And be sure to share your thoughts with us in English.